Okay, I'd like to invite two things. I'd like to invite the speakers to take a chair up here. I'd like to introduce Dr. Allan Green. Dr. Green has, I don't know how you fit. I was going to say I was the only MD in the room here when David was talking, and I didn't take it personally. And I remembered, fortunately, Allan is here. Any other MDs? A couple, okay. I don't feel too slighted. Allan has probably seen more of this industry than most people I know over the past 25, 30 years, beginning as the medical director of New England Nuclear, a company that played a critical role in growing the biomedical innovation industry in the Massachusetts area in the 70s. He has an MD, a PhD, and a JD, has been involved in too many companies to list here, I'm sorry. And when I started Verigenics many years ago, was a very valuable advisor to me personally. He was working at ML Strategies, associated with the Mintz-Levin law firm, and Allan is now in a independent practice, also working with a number of nonprofits. And I've asked Allan not to show more slides here, but rather to serve a bit as a rapporteur to what we've heard today. Building on your own experience, and then also to use the panel to continue to develop some of the issues we've heard about just now.
Great.
Okay, if you give me 1 second here, I will. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I certainly want to thank Bentley and Dr. Ledley. This has been a really remarkably valuable set of presentations. I think sometimes it's very hard when you ask folks who have gone along in careers, often very successful careers, to try to reminisce about their background. Sometimes you get answers like that of J.B.S. Haldane, one of the most eminent scientists in England in the last century, who was asked, well, in your long career, Dr. Haldane, what have you learned? And his response, after thinking for a minute, he said, well, probably the most important thing was God's inordinate fondness for beetles. I think we've learned a great deal more today, and I think one of the things that we have to see is that, in fact, you learn from success and you learn from failure. And one of the things that Dr. Ledley had said at the outset is that if you're going to work in an entrepreneurial field, you really can't fear failure. We've emphasized the successes today, but I think you have to understand that they really are what some call black swans, which is they're rare. When you look at all the money that's been invested in biotechnology, life sciences, communications, and IT, the companies that survive and thrive are a limited subset of the total number of groups, which really people have put hard-earned capital, sweat equity, which is their time, their careers into. And we have to know that you have to assume risk when you take on something that's truly new and truly science. But having had a medical practice, a research career, and now for the last 15 years focused on the law and how it really interacts with science. I'll tell you, one of my favorite stories is also that of F.E. Smith, Lord Birkenhead, who had a contentious relationship with a circuit judge in England, who in one case, when Smith appeared before him, said, Mr. Smith, I have read your brief in this case. Over the weekend, I find I am no wiser. Smith looked at him and said, perhaps not, Your Honor, but much better informed. And, you know, today, I think hearing the gentleman to your right, we're all much better informed. And what we really want to do here is take most of the remaining time to give you a chance to ask questions. But I do want to bore you for just 2 minutes with one other issue that has developed And that is, there's a field of science known as regulatory science. Huh? What's that? I know physics. What's regulatory science? Well, one of the things you have to know in the life sciences area, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, is that if you're going to be in this field, 95% of the dollars you spend are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration or by its similar organizations in Europe, Japan, and other major markets. And in order to understand how to evaluate programs and exercise the business judgment that we've really heard about today, one has to understand that regulatory process. Because it turns out it's not just a set of disembodied rules. It's the consensus that public policy, as expressed by congressional statute, has brought us to in this country. And as I said briefly in response to one of the earlier questions, it provides the substrate in many ways for pharmaceuticals and medical device industry to really work within our political system as well as within the economic system in this country. And FDA, far from being a barrier, is really the source of a number of processes that today we take for granted, which create a much stronger industry and a much safer set of products for all of us. When you really think about the rules for clinical trials, I don't know if most of you know where those come from, but during World War II, there are a series of experimentations in the Nazi camps that led to Nuremberg principle that protects individuals. During the Soviet period, there were incarcerations in psychiatric hospitals for political reasons, which led to a series of international statements reflecting the importance of individual autonomy and the ability of people to make their own decisions involving important events in their lives. And we think of these as overseas issues, but in fact, when you think of the United States, unfortunately, errors have happened here. Tuskegee, where the syphilis experiments in African Americans were carried out, people exposed to the syphilis bacteria, followed without being given treatment, ostensibly for scientific purposes to see what would happen. There were no rules governing scientific experimentation in those days. And although there's a complicated process, the truth is that the rules followed today in this country are largely an outgrowth of effort by the FDA to control what we do in the clinic, how we deal with these inventions. And when we think of what FDA does, it really brings current contemporary ethics into play in this business. And one of the consequences is certainly the fact that probably American pharmaceutical products, medical devices, are probably the most respected in the world. And there is now a set of international agreements that reflect this process that's really been widely adopted. I will say that in deference to the time, one of the things to think about is you don't think about this regulatory process very much. It's key to the success of business. It's key to getting inventions tested in humans. And we're all interested in liberal education and business as well as science. And I'd just remind you of Ovid's, I think, great quote that happy is she who knows the causes of things. So branching out from areas of focus, whether it's in science, in business, in psychology, in economics, in trying to at least understand the vocabulary of all these areas is an important thing to do. And I, for one, will thank the speakers because they've really helped us to understand business, science, and a lot of the areas that hopefully you'll be able to take advantage in your own careers. And so this is supposed to be a discussion, not an exhortation. And one of the things that I'd like to ask the speakers, and we'll ask for questions after this, is really, in order to do all of the great things we've heard about, one of the things that is needed is capital. It takes money to do that. And when you're building a website, you can get it up and going, get 250,000 eyeballs on it in 3 months. If you remember the timelines we saw today, it takes 5 to 10 years or longer to get commercial issue from the projects that we are hearing about. And I'd like to ask the speakers in turn to say what they see happening in that area. Will the money be available to keep doing these wonderful things that we've heard about today? So I don't know who wants to start.
I think the answer is the money will be available. It may not be available in the way it's been available in the past. The challenge is that I think when I look back to what the biotech and pharmaceutical industry looked like 20 years ago, there was really much more of a division between biotech and pharma. Pharma was doing drug research, biotech was doing research on recombinant DNA and antibodies. They were collaborating and partnering together, and the venture capital communities were relying on the biotech company collaborating with larger companies or getting to a point where they could market themselves. And today, you see a lot less research going on in the pharma companies. You see a lot more clinical development going on, perhaps in the pharma companies, and late-stage development, which uses up a lot of their R&D resources, and maybe a little more funding at the universities is happening from big pharma. But I personally have real doubts that you're going to see the kind of innovation that comes straight from the university to big pharma. And I think I completely agree with what David said. It's creating room for entrepreneurial groups of individuals to get together and fill that void. And I think the venture capitalists, if you put together a plan, will fund them. The people who get the funding are probably the younger people who had a chance to work with the prior generation that succeeded and are able to leverage, and it gets to a question someone asked about relationships, leverage those relationships to the venture capitalists to get the funding. They tend to fund people they know have a track record. So I don't think it's all the one or the other. It's kind of where I come down.
I guess what I'd say is that the way these things were funded back in the, say 80s and 90s is the VCs were the primary funder. And having raised money over the last 10 years at my company, Angel Medical, it's no longer a straight VC play. In order to do it, you have to have a combination of things, and this combination is angel investors who are much easier to sway, and they may not put up $10 million, but you find some good ones. They might put up a couple over a number of years. The VCs are still involved, but there's a lot less VC money going into medicine now than there was before. But the strategics have picked it up a little bit more. So my current company has 2 VCs, a bunch of angels, two strategics, Johnson & Johnson and St. Jude Medical, and we just added a new investor group, a bunch of private equity guys who have formed their own little kind of angel group in our last round of financing. So it's a lot tougher than it used to be. There's still a way to do it, but it's not, it's challenging but doable, I guess is what I would say.
So I agree with the other comments made. I think one could always potentially look back and say, oh, it was much easier then. But I think the world continues to change. So, for example, I think there is money. I think you can raise money for good projects. And I think that will continue to be the case. But I think that, as has been detailed, I think the sources of funding change. So, for example, I'm involved right now in a company called Summit PLC, and we have a drug in development for muscular dystrophy. We recently ran a phase 1 trial that was entirely funded by patient foundations. We have another project which is an antibiotic, and we have a lot of funding from the Wellcome Trust, which was the former owner of a pharmaceutical company that became a foundation. So there is money, but you have to think of different types of sources from prior times.
I want to both really ask a question in way of answer here. Bruce, you had made a comment, not today, but a previous one of our board meetings, that when we were talking about all the construction going on in Cambridge and all the pharma companies really establishing what looked like very large research institutions in the Boston area, Roche, I think, became the last of the major pharmas to move in this week. You actually thought that, in fact, this was a downsizing of research, that the number of positions they've eliminated, Nutley, New Jersey, and Groton, is much larger than what they're putting in here. And ostensibly they're doing it because they can now talk to the MDs across the street, and we've heard David's comments about MDs. And I just wonder whether you think this is a viable strategy to accelerate, because it would seem like they're bringing together teams that don't have the requisite skills necessarily based on what we've heard about today.
I'm not sure I really know the answer, so let's not put too much weight on it. But I think they're locating here as a way of downsizing their overall research departments to do two things. One, to relate directly to the institutions at the medical school at MIT, but also to have direct connections with startup companies that they might be able to license or buy. So I think they're looking at it that way. But there's another area, and it's an area that Allan and I may actually completely disagree on, so I'll bring it up. I think the biotech industry shot itself in the foot a couple years ago with the passage of the Affordable Care Act and as part of the enactment of the biosimilars pathway. And one of the things that was a big fight in that area was, if we're going to allow biosimilars onto the market, which are essentially generic versions of biologics, that in order to make it still a viable investment proposition for biotech companies, you need to provide 12 years of market exclusivity independent of patent rights for all the products. And I actually never thought that mattered one way or another from a biosimilar company's perspective, but I think it has a systemic, insidious effect on the way large companies have now thought about their portfolio decisions and what to invest in R&D, because now you don't have to worry about inventing something and getting a patent to get 12 years exclusivity after you launch a drug or a biologic, rather, under this law. You can do something that's incremental and a little bit less revolutionary, launch it, get 12 years, and I think that the effect of that is to benefit the companies that have products on the market, but to really reduce the incentive to invest in discovery research and what I'd call what used to be the real innovative kernel of what was going on in biotech. And when I talk to people in big pharma today, they'll actually say, yeah, we're not doing that anymore because we can now do clinical trials and get the next version, the next antibody that goes for the same target as someone else, and we can get 12 years, so we're fine. And I think we may have actually, in thinking we were doing something good, hurt ourselves.
I think that the Biosimilar Act, when you talk about it, is really the equivalent of what's known, and let me use the jargon, the Hatch-Waxman Act, which was a provision of the U.S. Food and Drug Law that provides the opportunity for generic drug companies to make a copy of originator drugs, of drugs that companies have invented, have patents on, brought to market. But once the patents expire, there is an interest in getting copies of the drugs on the market without having to invest in toxicology and new human studies that would not really add any scientific knowledge about safety or efficacy. So the arrangement between the government and industry in the Hatch-Waxman law was that once the patents expire, a generic company can bring a copy of the drug to market and rely on the previous information filed by the originator company to get their approval. So FDA can look at the toxicology done by somebody else. And when you do that, under some circumstances, you get exclusivity, and it may be 6 months or 3 years or 5 years, depending on whether you do a new formulation or change the chemistry in some other way. But just like the biological drug, what that means is that during that exclusive period, somebody can't copy exactly what you have done and rely on your information. They can always go in and make another antibody. It may have a slightly different structure. In fact, it probably will have a different structure. And one of the differences between generics drugs and originator drugs takes hundreds of $millions to make most new drug products, small molecule drug products. It takes perhaps $1 million to $1.5 million to make a generic copy of the drug. We're dealing with wildly different economics. Why does the government care about this and make all these laws? Because when you have a patent, you have a monopoly. When you have a copy of a drug and you have 5, 6, 8, 12 companies making generic copies, you have price competition. And when you look at the expiration of, say, Lipitor, the cholesterol-lowering drug from Pfizer, the largest selling drug once in the world, the price is down to about 15% of what it was. And the government, through Medicare and Medicaid, pays less money to industry. Government loves generic drugs. Okay, so now we're to biologics. Will this same thing happen with antibodies or proteins? No. And the reason is every protein known to man that has gone into pharmaceuticals has side effects. It has immunology. It's not our protein, it's somebody else's protein. And so people make antibodies to it. And we don't understand all of the things that lead to these antibody formations. And so every protein has to be individually tested so that we know what its risk is as well as what the efficacy is. And the real difference between biologicals is that anybody who makes a copy will have to invest in a complicated production process and in human testing that will cost, I don't know if hundreds of millions of dollars, but one is required to do at least 500 to 1,500 patients and at least 300 patients for a full year of exposure. Instead of $1 million for a generic, we're going to see the need for $100 million for a biosimilar drug. Where am I going with this? Because I'm trying to answer your question, and it may not be clear what the answer is to me. The answer to me is the 12 years of exclusivity simply means you can't rely on somebody else's data to get your drug approved. It doesn't mean you can't make your own antibody to the same antigen, test it, make sure that it's safe, do those 1,500 patients, show that it works, that it has the appropriate efficacy. And I think what we're seeing is that since it costs so much money, we're going to see not what we see in the generics business. We're going to see where we really have a relatively free competition between companies. What we're going to is from the monopoly that Biogen and Amgen and Abbott and others have to an oligopoly. But these companies are still going to be able to control prices, which is at the heart of the answer, and they're likely to spend $100 or $200 million to get into those markets, because once you're there, you have a very good franchise. The other part of the answer is a biosimilar is not necessarily interchangeable the way small molecule drug products are. And so if you invest the $200 million, you still have a unique product that physicians, which I still am. Fred still are. We're very suspicious people. We're not even sure that one preparation of digitalis is the same as the other. I think we last prescribed that 40 years ago, but we still think about it. So it's actually a very different market, so I think it will encourage more activity in the area, and where a lot of that will come from, and I'll stop, will be from Asia. We've had many inquiries from there.
So I'd like to ask you guys to refocus a little bit. I think that this is a key conversation for society at the moment. But I wonder if it's a little bit emblematic of the problem I outlined at the beginning, which is in the time since some of these drugs were approved, the science is not tenfold better, it's 100-fold better. To go back, I think, to the question we had a moment ago, where is that going to come from? You know, the high risk, cutting edge science that you need to have the kind of advances that drug coated liposomes or drug encapsulated liposomes had, that drug eluting stents had, that monoclonals have had. Those types of sort of revolutionary or near revolutionary advances aren't going to come from resolving how do you reduce the cost of medicine by bringing in a new generation of products, prove they're equally safe, and things like that. And I worry sometimes that because there are so many opportunities to make money from, you know, we had the issue of imitation curves. There is an idea that it is when you go to, and I think, Bruce, your company's articulated this, that it is when you go to biosimilars or generics with a lower price, that now forces the entrepreneurs to go to the brand new technologies and look for that next big leap. And I just wonder how you see this playing out. We have this tremendous pressure on cost reduction. It plays out in the courts, it plays out in the marketplace. But where is the innovation? How is it going to be funded? Can the things you've seen in your professional lifetimes happen again?
Yeah, I actually think that the innovation is going to come from where the unmet needs are that society is really calling for. And I just get what I actually, let me just make one comment. I was actually focused on the impact of the 12 years on biotech companies. I wasn't actually trying to get into a biosimilar debate, which could take us hours and distract the discussion. What I was concerned about with that was exactly what you're raising, Fred, which is it's easier now. There's such an attractiveness to do something incremental and get your 12 years in a large organization now that as a large pharma company, you're not going to have as much of your portfolio directed towards what I would have considered the early stage biotech novel companies. And it's what I would describe as an unintended side effect of the benefit. There are costs and benefits to the 12 years, and I think the 12 years are benefiting the larger companies and they're hurting the smaller biotech research companies. Now, put all that aside, that doesn't mean they're going away. There's still going to be investment. And I think where the investment's going to come from is where people figure out, it's just like what David did. It's where people figure out where's there an unmet need in terms of medicine that's going to get them the investment research to either understand the biology so you can invent a better medicine, or one of the things that people are starting to work on now, let me give you an example, and others here probably know more about it, is we've had an obsession in biotech and in the pharma industry for the past 10 years to do, largely because of the monoclonal inventions, what people call targeted research. They find a target on a cell that appears to have a function, and let's direct a drug or an antibody towards it, and it's going to fix that disease. And what we're learning more and more through the anti-cancer drugs is they might really work beautifully initially to knock down the tumor, but then it comes back stronger afterwards. And that the biology is a lot more complicated in terms of the network and the systems of the biology. And at some point, The investment's going to go into companies that are looking at multi-targeted approaches, at systems biology approaches. You're seeing work going on at the universities in that area now. I'm at a company that happens to be involved with some biosimilars, but we're also heavily involved in novel development, and that's some of the work we're doing in other companies. And I know
Yeah, just to sort of make the point that NIH is still the biggest funder of research in this country. And so there's a tremendous amount of basic research that is generating new relationships, new targets, and new interactions. And so this systems biology really is sort of opening up an area that small entrepreneurs can come into, and they can focus on either new targets or combinations of targets, or retargeting old drugs to new targets that a large pharma would be very difficult to find their way into and think there might be something there. And NIH is also supporting innovative translational research now with larger translational grants. And so this has happened in the last about 18 months. And so there are other sources of funding that for certain projects, you can take a drug well into a phase 1 that would be supported by NIH under the proper circumstances. And there's a third thing in terms of funding this generation of small companies, is that there's a huge infrastructure of service companies around. And so when we set up LTI was a fully integrated, more or less, pharmaceutical company. And gene medicine, it started to go that way, to try to handle everything. Animal studies, all of the preclinical toxicology, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to do that anymore. And so you can have a semi-virtual company that has a very small core group that is all you need, because you only have one product that you're focusing on. It's not like you're going to have a pipeline coming down the road, to be perfectly honest, a pipeline coming down the road that's going to be peeling off products every year. And so you can now get up and get going with a smaller group, with a smaller investment, and you can find additional sources of funding. And you had mentioned this, patient advocacy groups. There's a lot of advocacy groups, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and others, that will help you get a medicine that they think can cure their disease. So I think there's other sources of funding, and I think NIH and university researchers are still churning out good, useful information, connecting drugs, antibodies, and medicine.
I want to say a little bit about the cost issue, because many years ago, my dad and I put together a list of what it takes to make a successful medical device, and we started with this list. It has to be good for the patient. Well, that's kind of obvious. It has to be something that's not going to take a huge amount of doctor training, meaning like stents were easy because they already knew how to do balloons. You have to have a large and growing patient population, or no one's going to put money into it. We've now added one thing to this list. It has to make more money for the doctor. My favorite story is my dad invented a rechargeable pacemaker that would last for 30 years, and it was a commercial failure because all the doctors made money by replacing them every 2 years. And then they got better batteries, and they lasted 7 years, but the rechargeable died because the doctors didn't make more money at it. But the new thing on the list is, to really be successful, newer technologies may need to save money for the healthcare system. And as I talked about, the new stent that can save 20 minutes and $500 a case because you need less equipment and is faster. My implantable heart attack detection system, well, people who've survived a first heart attack, if they have a second heart attack, are twice as likely to end up in heart failure, which is the most expensive thing to the healthcare system in the United States. So we think ultimately we may be able to show that at least it's cost neutral and maybe saves a little money for the healthcare system. One would think the FDA did not care about this. The FDA, who you were saying all these great things about, unfortunately, Their job is not to regulate the practice of medicine. That's what doctors and doctor groups are supposed to do. They're also not supposed to be responsible for what gets paid for or whether products are competitive or not. However, over the last 10, 20 years, they have believed themselves that they are responsible for all of this. In a number of cases, they've approved that Taxol eluting stent much faster than they should have. A year and a half later, there was a huge recall because the balloons were not deflating and they were getting stuck open in people's coronary arteries, having emergency bypass surgery. And they had plenty of data on that in their own website. Before they approved it, they just didn't pay any attention to it. Similarly, they wanted to see it get out early. The other thing is that all their problems now with bad metal hips and so on is that they've approved things in ways that probably shouldn't have been approved, but they're not doing good post-market surveillance. They're not tracking these devices after they're out there well, and as a result, for the last 5 years, it's also been a bitch. They basically decided, well, if we can't track them after or we're doing badly, we can't get in trouble if we don't approve anything. So they stopped approving things as well. They just said no. The good news is we're seeing some changes, at least on the device side of the FDA. They've got some good people finally. They're starting to be predictable, and I'm looking forward to the next 5 years, hopefully being one where at least all they want is good science, which is sort of all that those of us in industry can ask for.
So I want to talk a little bit about innovation, and maybe to some of the undergraduates in the audience. I think there are enormous opportunities for innovation, and I actually criticize the pharma biotech industry for being narrow-minded. So an example of innovation, and specifically for the non-science oriented, so think of some problems that we have in the US today. Approximately 50% of patients who are given chronic therapy after a relatively short period of time don't continue taking it. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that, but I'm merely and that has an enormous impact on the healthcare system, the obesity explosion. So there are a lot of issues which the answer is not going to be a new drug. There are going to be other ways of thinking about it. We now have the capacity through huge databases to track and identify all sorts of issues. For example, you may have seen the recent Google initiative to look at the spread of flu through flu searches. So I think there is potential, and people are going to do innovation which is not classically being thought of as technical, but is going to have a big impact on the healthcare system. And I'm just going to spend another few seconds just throwing out one example from a completely different world, which is, it's actually an example I quite like to comment upon, is if you think about FedEx. Before FedEx was invented, people knew how to move packages from one place to another, but they did it in an entirely innovative way and created a whole new industry and a whole new efficiency in business. And I think if you think about the business of medicine and healthcare, we're going to see innovations which are very different combinations than have previously been thought of, and I think there are enormous opportunities.
So I'm going to wrap this up here because we have lots of time to talk across the hall. And one thing you learn running a company is never stand between your employees and the bar. And there is food and a cash bar across the hall. I'd just like to sum up. I thought I probably would have gone on longer, but Mike's concluding comments were so perfect. I thought it was the right time to end. I recently wrote a blog on the Bentley website. Bentley has a blog site called Impact. And looking at a paper by Robert Gordon, who argues that this current revolution in science and technology over the last 20 years has not generated economic growth, and he has all sorts of reasons why that might be. It's Paul Kruger wrote about this several weeks ago in the New York Times. It's well worth reading. even if you tear it to shreds when you're done because you're so frustrated. Not Kruger's piece, the Robert Gordon's piece. I think what we forget is how much business has to change in lockstep with science. The biotechnology industry, the device industry we described today, did not exist before 1980 or before the mid-70s. Simply, there was no model for this. I think looking at a previous generation of inventors, the things they had to do to take great ideas forward were completely unrelated before the advent of venture capital, before small entrepreneurial companies, before incubators, and before this notion of alliances with large pharma companies, as opposed to this not invented here, which was very classic of pharma in the 60s and 70s and the old IBM model before PCs. You've seen revolutionary changes in industry, and they probably have to happen again. The analogy that Gordon brought up was, well, there were technological revolutions 100 years ago, and they created exponential economic growth. Think about what those changes in business were. It wasn't just the emergence of venture capital in entrepreneurial forums. It was the invention of assembly lines and labor unions and all the things that happened. So I think Mike's concluding point that there need to be changes in the way you think of it, whether it's bringing together public health and drugs, whether it's the role of devices that cure as opposed to drugs that maintain, to really think about the big picture of how business and science have to be integrated. That's where I started today, how business and science have to be integrated. And with that, I'd like to stop. I think you've heard how quickly discussions of science and how integrally they get related with issues of patent law, with issues of markets. There was this panel, I hope you heard it. These are big issues here about exclusivity, about patents, about the role of the FDA. That's all part of the business, it's all part of strategy, and it's all part of what leads to success at the inventor's business. And with that, I want to really thank people for coming. I want to thank the panel here for extraordinary work in bringing this together and for your time and your talent and your insights. And I want to thank Donna Connor, first and finally. She's probably setting up for all the work to make this happen. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to talking to you all across the hall.